Hello, here we go for another episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast with your hosts, myself, Bernhard Günther, and my wife, Laura Matsu. And this is a biggie, very big topic because we've actually gotten a lot of requests also to talk about this. And we're going to talk about Atlantis, our Atlantean karma. Will we repeat the fall of Atlantis? Now, obviously, there's a lot of mystery around this ancient civilization of Atlantis. Some people completely deny it existed. Obviously, it doesn't fit into the official history narrative and all of that. Others cannot agree on its location, or they're very focused on the physical location. However, there's enough data and information from Plato, Rudolf Steiner, and others that point to its existence and the subsequent destruction or sinking of Atlantis, which interestingly relates maybe to the biblical flood. That could be an analogy related to the sinking of this once very highly advanced and powerful civilization. Around the world, there are traces of Atlantean culture that still remains hidden in myths, monuments, and esoteric traditions. Yet, as Thomas Meyer said also in one of our past podcasts, recognizing these signs and of Atlantis for what they truly are requires actually a trained eye and an awakened intuition, because Atlantis didn't just exist on the physical plane. And experience has shown that reference to Atlantis is often unavoidable when considering individual karma, because many unresolved karmic entanglements can be traced back to the later part of this epoch, as Thomas Meyer was writing about. So many of us are actually descendants of Atlantis, and we carry its karma and unresolved past life trauma as well. In many ways, we are playing now the same story in a different timeline, and we may re-experience the fate of Atlantis again, leading to our destruction if we don't learn the lessons this time around. So this is key. So basically, this podcast is more than just an ancient history lesson. It's really a spiritual wake-up call too. We're going to draw from the visionary insights of Plato, Rudolf Steiner, Edgar Cayce, and others as we explore the rise and fall of Atlantis, and also how it relates to ancient Egypt, and that mirrored the exact dilemma also we face today, which is the misuse of technology, the temptation of power, the tunnel vision of materialism and identification with the physical body and ego, and the loss of connection to spirit and our divine nature. All these themes are very, very obvious in this day and age as well. Now, in part one, we'll be discussing the forgotten wisdom and the tragic downfall of Atlantis, and how that karma was carried into Egypt's mystery schools. We look at how the spiritual knowledge was preserved, distorted, and weaponized, essentially, and how many of us alive today are the very souls who lived through it all, now returning to face the consequences and hopefully choose differently. Now, in part two, which is, as most listeners know, only for members, you can sign up to the membership at my website, veilofreality.com, get access to all the second hours of over 150 podcast episodes. Now, in that second part, we take all of that information from Steiner, from Cayce, and others, and Plato as well, and how that Atlantean karma plays out nowadays when we are confronted with the echoes, basically, of Atlantis in our modern world through transhumanism, biomedical intervention, ties into the COVID mRNA vaccine, many other things, the growing split between materialism and spiritual consciousness, the technocracy. And the question is really no longer what happened also back then, but what will we do now? That's really the key point. And we want to also give practical suggestions and reflective questions, right, for you guys who may be connected to that ancient Atlantean Egyptian karma. So we can resolve it, transmute it, and also understand how this affects us not only collectively, but also personally. Again, we find this knowledge is crucial because the same forces that once brought down a very great civilization are rising again. And this time, really, the choice is ours. This must be ours. Will we repeat the fall, experience Atlantis 2.0, or rise into a new chapter of human evolution? All right. So let's start out with one of the main sources, more the popular source, I think maybe even more acknowledged in the mainstream, and that's Plato's account of Atlantis. And the main source of this are his books Timaeus and Critias. And Atlantis is there introduced as part of a conversation between Socrates, Timaeus, Critias, and Hermocrates. And in this dialogue, that story is actually presented as true history, not just as a metaphor or symbolism, but as a true history that apparently was passed down from an Egyptian priests to Solon and then to Critias' grandfather and ultimately to Plato. So we already see here a connection from Atlantis to Egypt. Now, according to Plato's account, Atlantis existed about 9,000 years before the time of Solon, who was an Athenian lawmaker. Now, Solon lived around 600 BCE, so 9,000 years before 600 BCE, that's approximately 9,600 BCE. That would place the fall of Atlantis or the existence of Atlantis around 11,600 years ago, which is very interesting because it aligns with the end of the last ice age and the time of major global climate shifts. Other researchers have made references to that ice age, including Graham Hancock, by the way, who many of you guys might be popular. I don't think he's specifically talking about Atlantis, but that something significantly happened around this period of time. Now, according to Plato, Atlantis was a very advanced, wealthy civilization ruled by kings descended from the god Poseidon. It was a vast island kingdom and, quote, larger than Libya and Asia combined, so a huge continent located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which is nowadays modern Gibraltar down in South Spain. It contained a central mountain that was surrounded by concentric rings of land and sea. There was an advanced canal system and massive palace complex at the center, according to Plato. The capital city was an architectural and engineering marvel. The people of Atlantean or the Atlantean society was originally very wise, virtuous, and very spiritually attuned. Already Plato pointed that out. The society was built on spiritual laws and in harmony with nature, which we'll see is very interesting. All of these ideas or the way the Atlanteans lived also relates then to what Steiner and Edgar Cayce said. But until power and greed and materialism corrupted the Atlanteans. Now, over generations, then the Atlanteans become very materialistic, selfish, and corrupt. Their divine nature was diluted by human traits, so to speak, or the lower human nature, and they sought to dominate the world, becoming imperial and greedy, which resulted in the final cataclysm with massive floods and earthquakes, and according to Plato, destroyed in a single day and night of misfortune. Zeus, the god Zeus, seeing the fall from virtue, decided to punish them, basically. It's very interesting. It's almost like as the divine is pushing the reset button because it didn't go according to divine will or they didn't learn the lesson, so we need to restart this operational experiment over, so to speak. Interestingly, in Plato's work, this dialogue in Critias breaks off at the moment Zeus is about to deliver judgment, leaving Atlantis' destruction unfinished in the text, but it's still referenced in the book with Timaeus. And here's a quote from Plato's book. He says, "When the divine portion began to fade away, they became full of selfishness and unrighteous power." So the theme of Atlantis is really about having power, having technological advancement, even spiritual advancement, and even being aligned somewhat with the higher nature, but then abusing that power and falling into the fall from Eden, maybe even could be related to that, into ego, selfishness, and black magic as well.
Okay, so next we're going to go into Rudolf Steiner's writing about Atlantis. We're going to look at what he wrote about in the Akashic Chronicle. So Steiner didn't claim to uncover Atlantis through traditional archaeology or historical research. As we know, the Atlanteans did eventually manifest physically, but a lot of it was happening non-physically, so that makes sense. Instead, he used his clairvoyant abilities to access what he called the Akashic Chronicle, probably exactly the same as what we also call the Akashic records, which is a spiritual record of all that has ever happened. And in his preface to Cosmic Memory, he writes, "The events described here are not the product of historical research in the ordinary sense, but a result of reading the Akashic Chronicle." So this is him accessing through his supersensory abilities all the events and memories that happened during these times. And according to Steiner, Atlantis existed for approximately 1 million years, developing through several evolutionary phases, and its final destruction occurred nearly 10,000 years ago. So again, he agrees with actually Plato as far as the fall. And Atlantis was a vast continent located between Europe and America, mostly submerged today beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the fourth root race framework. We're not going to get into the details of Steiner's evolutionary cosmology that leads us up to humanity today, but we will talk about the connection between today and what we know as the human race. So Atlantis corresponds to the fourth root race in Steiner's sevenfold human evolution model. And each root race represents a different phase of soul and consciousness development. And Atlantis followed the Lemurian epoch, the third root race, and proceeded to the Aryan epoch, the fifth root race, which is what we know to be modern humanity, you and I. So what's most important is there is an etheric constitution of Atlanteans, and their etheric body was more dominant, which is what allowed them to manipulate life force with ease. As we mentioned earlier, the Atlanteans were clairvoyant. They had access to etheric forces. They had a living connection to nature. Their actions were guided by vivid imaginative memory images rather than logical reasoning. This was contrasted with the Lemurian times, where human beings were still very etheric with less defined physical bodies. So in Lemurian times, consciousness was more dreamlike, instinctual, and connected to the spiritual world. But by the time of the Atlanteans, humans solidified into more physical form with denser bodies and more individuality and memory. That's probably more near the end. I mean, if they existed for millions of years, they were also existing etherically for much of this time, but then began to manifest physically. That's the most important point. So as evolution progressed, what Steiner talked about is their bodies condensed and became more akin to modern humans. And by the end of the Atlantean epoch, they were fully incarnated into physical matter, which laid the groundwork for our current race. And so the Atlantean social structure was really also guided by the mystery temples, the initiation schools. Early Atlantean society was led by divine messengers, meaning these were high spiritual beings who incarnated to guide human development. Later leadership transitioned to initiated humans who were trained in the mysteries. So the people who led them later on in their development were priest kings, and they ruled through giving people spiritual insight, giving people clairvoyant wisdom. And the mystery temples served as centers for spiritual and scientific knowledge and training. And they were the places where the initiated made contact with higher spiritual beings. And Atlanteans also possessed spiritual technologies, Steiner discussed. And these spiritual technologies were based on being able to use their will, sound, and etheric forces to affect the physical world. And they used levitation. They used etheric power for transportation and constructions. Vehicles were guided by mental forces and harmonics. There was weather manipulation, agriculture, animal communication. All of this was done via what we would perceive to be magical or psychic means. And then Steiner discusses the fall and corruption of Atlantis. So as Atlanteans became more influenced by Luciferic entities and more adversary spirits like the Seratic beings, they became tempted with power and control. And these Luciferic spirits stimulated intellect and self-awareness, which granted humans freedom and discernment between good and evil, but also exposed them to temptation and moral confusion.
On this real quick, it's really fascinating because as you was reading this, it reminds me also of the the fall from Eden, right? And eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge.
Exactly.
And of good and evil, right?
Exactly.
And the duality, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And then this is when the misuse of spiritual power began, and magic was used for domination, control, material gain. This is going to be really interesting because actually the Pluto and Scorpio generation is known in evolutionary astrology for having past lives in Egypt. Therefore, since Egypt was the place where the Atlanteans went to after the fall, one of the places. This is also a theme of Pluto and Scorpio, by the way, domination, control, and misuse of power. So just as to side note that. Basically, their own ego and separation from divine law caused both inner and outer imbalances. And the Seratic spirits, who were spiritual beings known for millennia to be active in power and domination, abuse and war, and black magic, these beings were especially drawn to the humans' lust for power, basically. So they basically started making these traps of agreement with these beings. And here's a quote from Thomas Meyer, and he says, "There are the Seratic spirits known for eons that are active in hate, power, abuse, war, and black magic. These are particularly attracted by humans' lust for power. This was already the case in the Atlantean age when much of the mystery sites drifted into selfishness and abusive magic, ultimately leading to the downfall of Atlantis. An individual gains greater power over others through a connection to Seratic spirits. The term black magic refers to any magical work serving selfish ends. A connection with Seratic spirits pervades every kind of black magic." End quote. And again, that's from Thomas Meyer, from his book, The COVID Vaccine.
The spiritual consequences of the COVID vaccine.
Yeah. So in essence, Atlantean priests and leaders began to turn away from the higher divine spiritual realms, choosing instead to align with these seductive adversarial spirits. They also engaged in powerful spiritual forces without the moral development or inner maturity required to wield them responsibly. This is so key because actually we see now with this evolution of the new age and all sorts of stuff and all sorts of kind of stuff going around, there's a little bit of a similarity there, to say the least. And basically, these Atlantean priests were driven by egoic desires. They had a hunger for greater power over others, and they became willing to pursue any action that was possible just for the sake of power, regardless of spiritual consequence. So in doing so, in engaging in this black magic and the abuse of power, these priests led their civilization into a downfall. They dragged the entire population into a collapse, which was a karmic consequence that they themselves had set into motion. And nowadays, people are also being seduced by the effects of Atlantean magic, but don't understand the spirits that are behind it. So as Steiner pointed out, quote, "These beings now have gained a great influence over many inhabitants of the earth. And people were more and more deprived of the feeling for the spirit," end quote. So the misuse of these etheric forces led to these natural cataclysms, flood, earthquakes, the volcanic upheavals. Steiner locates this final destruction of Atlantis around 10,000 BCE, again, same time frame as Plato talked about. And there was actually a split that Steiner discussed, a split between white initiates, people who used magic for wisdom, and black initiates who used magic for manipulation. And a spiritually advanced group was chosen to carry forward humanity's true evolutionary impulse. And these initiates were guided to safety and then became seed of the Aryan root race, which is what we know to be modern humanity.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So it definitely correlates already with some of what Plato has discussed in his accounts on Atlantis, right? And so here's where Egypt comes in, because Rudolf Steiner then also connects ancient Egypt with the legacy of Atlantis. And again, we're not talking about any official history of Egypt or anything like that. And Steiner described Egypt as one of the key post-Atlantean cultures that preserved and transformed Atlantean wisdom. As a matter of fact, the mystery temples of Egypt were descendants of the Atlantean mystery schools, according to Steiner. Again, in both civilizations, initiates were seen as divine messengers or missionaries of higher spiritual beings. The Egyptian initiates preserved the Atlantean esoteric knowledge, but recast it in symbolic and architectural form with the pyramids, hieroglyphs, initiation rites, and so forth. Now, this Egyptian spiritual science became more formalized and veiled in contrast to the instinctive clairvoyance of the Atlanteans. Again, we have to understand that, like as Laura described, since Atlantis evolved over almost a million years in Steiner's account, from this etheric to the physical embodiment. And Egypt was fully physical incarnation of human beings. Now, Steiner implied that many Egyptian sages were reincarnated Atlantean initiates. But then the decline of Egypt happened. Over time, the living spiritual wisdom of Egypt became also rigid and externalized. And Steiner described this as the, quote, mummification of wisdom or spiritual mummification, which is very interesting. It's a cultural process mirroring the literal practice of mummifying bodies. We all know this, right? The mummies, we have even Hollywood movies about the mummy and all of that. But the ancient Egyptian mummification involved really a complex ritualistic procedure to preserve the physical form. And this process was actually once aimed at a rightful separation of body and spirit, preparing for spiritual transformation. As the body dies, the spirit or soul is being released to go into the afterlife, go transmute its karma to be ready for the next incarnation, right? To really understand that the body is just a vehicle for the soul or for the spirit. However, as in the decline of Egypt, in what he called the decadent period of Egypt, this process of the mummification became abused and exaggerated by a corrupted priest class. And then, similar to Atlantis, the early Egyptian priests worked in harmony with divine spiritual beings. But then over time, these priests lost their connection to the angelic hierarchies and which led basically to the cultural and spiritual decadence. Power struggles and distorted initiations arose within the priesthood, which then opened the door to Ahrimanic influences. These are forces, spirits, dark spirits that pull human consciousness into materialism, rigidity, and lifeless repetition, very mechanical way of existence. And these beings inspired a form of intelligence disconnected from the divine, leading to spiritual decay. And then also the Socratic forces came into play and began to enter through corrupted priesthoods who sought power, inspiring them to engage in black magic. Now, as a result of this spiritual decay, the mummification practice contributed to a stronger soul attachment to the physical body in future incarnations. Very interesting, right? So instead of the original intention of the mummification process to release the soul and spirit and honor that the body is just a physical vehicle, they now use the mummification process to bind the soul to the earthly realm. What that resulted then in more intensified ego identification with the personality and also an identification with the physical body, and promoted tendencies towards materialism, something which we obviously see strongly nowadays as well. Most people are highly identified with the physical body. So all of this created a corrupted class of priests, and they become susceptible to the adversarial spiritual forces. Esoteric knowledge became occulted and weaponized by this power-hungry elite. And that, just like with Atlantis, resulted into the necessary fall of Egypt. Necessary also because, according to Steiner, Egypt had to fall to lay the groundwork for the Christ impulse and the transition to individual spiritual freedom, which is the opportunity we have in this epoch and this time frame we're in right now. Now, this Egyptian karma, similar to the Atlantean karma, teaches the danger of preserving and identifying with outer forms while losing our inner connection to the spirit and the divine nature. And many, many individuals nowadays, we mentioned it before, and also according to Steiner, carry Atlantean Egyptian karma. We'll talk more about this, how this specifically plays out in this day and age and for you personally in the second hour. But Rudolf Steiner warned of repeating the Atlantean and Egyptian errors through materialism, identification with the physical body, denial of spirit, and misuse of power and technology, being tempted by Ahriman, as well as the dangers of spiritual power giving in to the Luciferian temptation.
Okay, so let's now discuss Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce was known as the sleeping prophet, as he gave over 14,000 psychic readings in a trance state, and around 700 of these mentioned Atlantis. And according to him, again, we have more corroboration that Atlantis was a real advanced civilization that existed as a large continent located in the Atlantic Ocean, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America now it is, to the Mediterranean. And according to him, Atlantis dates back as far as 200,000 years ago, and its technological spiritual peak was around 50,000 BCE. And society was divided into two main ideological factions, according to him. There was the Sons of the Law of One. These people followed universal laws. They honored the divine within all beings, and they used technology in service to the greater good. They practiced healing, energy work, soul development. They were aligned with cosmic principles and spiritual evolution. And the other ones are the sons of Belial, and they were about power, control, and material gratification. They practiced black magic, manipulation, and domination. And they used beings they created as things, possibly through genetic manipulation or cloning.
He literally called them things, by the way.
And Cayce presented this as the original spiritual polarity. Service to others versus service to self, which echoes later esoteric teachings. And, Atlantean technology was obviously very advanced, according to Edgar Cayce. They had a large domed crystal device, which they used to harness cosmic and earth energies for power, healing, and communication. And other technologies included flying machines like airships or thought-controlled vessels. Again, remember, they're working with magic, not necessarily machinery and industrialization like we do today. They also had submersibles and undersea transport. They also practiced genetic experimentation, including animal-human hybrids or things. They also had energy weapons and psychic technology, and they communicated via frequency, vibration, and telepathy. And then according to Cayce, the destruction of Atlantis was caused by the conflict between these two paths, spiritual unity versus material dominance, which ultimately led to Atlantis' downfall. And this was involving the misuse of spiritual and technological power. Also, he touched on the moral and karmic decay that especially happened from the sons of Belial. And then we also have the Atlanteans who tried to manipulate planetary forces, which destabilized the Earth crust. And according to Cayce, that happened in stages. So the destruction of Atlantis, according to Cayce, happened in three main stages. The first was around 50,000 BCE. The second was around 28,000 BC. And the final one was around 10,500 BC, which matches both Plato's and Steiner's timeline. The final destruction. And Cayce described three major destruction events that led to these massive floods, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions, and the gradual submergence of the land masses. And then after this happened, the survivors of the final cataclysm fled to Egypt, where they created new temples and mystery schools and the Great Pyramid, Yucatan and Central America, and they became the Toltecs, and they influenced Mayan culture, and Peru and the Andes, where they seeded early advanced megalithic civilizations, and as well as parts of Europe and the British Isles, where they became the Druids and the megalithic cultures. And then, again, Cayce emphasized that many modern souls are reincarnated Atlanteans. And these individuals may be drawn to spiritual teachings, energy and healing work. They may be drawn to sacred sites, metaphysical science, the spiritual sciences, and even advanced technology like AI. As well, they also have karmic wounds or unresolved past life issues from Atlantis, relating to misuse of power and relating to also the trauma from the destruction. So he felt to be on Earth now, we are all part of a karmic rebalancing mission where we're here to make different choices this time around. It's also about getting into right relationship with spiritual power these days too, I think we can see, especially in the new age, like this whole idea of like manifestation, using your thought forms to create reality, right? If you see, it's always like, not always, but it's often about how can I be richer? How can I be more powerful? How can I be famous? It's all about seeking, again, these consensus forms of power, actually. And so this is really interesting. And as I'll talk about in the second hour, it also relates to the Pluto and Scorpio generation, who are known in evolutionary astrology to have past lives in Egypt, therefore Atlantis. But you can see already that there is a re-emergence of an interest and understanding in spiritual technologies, but we're using them in alignment with materialism and service to self belief systems, basically. So that's fascinating. And basically, you know, to continue on with what Casey said, he felt that many Atlantean souls reincarnated into ancient Egypt to rebuild what was lost spiritually. And Casey predicted a return of Atlantean consciousness, which means advanced spiritual and technological awareness. And humanity is again standing at a crossroads between unity and destruction. And to quote Casey himself from reading 364-4, he says, quote, "In Atlantean land, the peoples were advanced in technical knowledge, yet fell because they lost the spiritual vision."
So very fascinating that Casey really mirrors closely also Rudolf Steiner's insights about Atlantis. Same themes, right? And the same theme that the Atlantean, after Atlantis' fall, the surviving descendants migrated or created Egypt as we know it nowadays, or ancient Egypt, right? It became the refuge of Atlantean wisdom. And according to Casey, after the final destruction of Atlantis, which again was about 10,500 BC, group of Atlantean initiates and priests fled to various parts of the world. And as Laura just mentioned, but Egypt being one of the primary destination. And these survivors brought with them advanced knowledge, including sacred geometry, astronomy, medicine, and spiritual science. And interestingly, one of Casey's most significant characters in the Egypt readings is Ra-Ta, who is a high priest who reincarnated multiple times, according to him. And Ra-Ta was originally from Atlantis and then became a spiritual reformer in Egypt around 10,500 BC, so around also the fall of Atlantis, right when ancient Egypt started, according to Casey. And he actually helped establish a renewed mystery school tradition, emerging Atlantean wisdom with earth-based spiritual paths in Egypt. And according to Casey, again, the Great Pyramid of Giza was designed and constructed around 10,500 BC by Ra-Ta and Atlantean engineers, most likely using quote-unquote magic or their psychic powers to manipulate physical matter, which we would see as magic because they had control over that, hence the mystery around how and who built the pyramid. And it was actually initially built as an initiation temple, not a tomb, right, which official history tells us it was just a tomb for the pharaohs and so forth. But it served actually as a repository of sacred knowledge. And again, like it was constructed, as it has mentioned, using levitation techniques or sound-based technology brought from Atlantis. Hence, they were very at ease able to manipulate those stones and move them into place. And here's another quote from Edgar Casey from one of his readings. Quote, "The pyramid was built as a hall of initiation. It was never intended as a tomb, but as a record in stone of initiation and enlightenment." End quote. Now, very interestingly, Casey also claimed that there's a hall of records that exists beneath the Sphinx, containing detailed records of the rise and fall of Atlantis, Atlantean science and history, the migration of survivors, and prophecies and information about Earth's spiritual evolution. This hall beneath the Sphinx was sealed during the last stages of Atlantis to preserve it for a future time when humanity would be ready to awaken. Very interestingly, he said it would be discovered, quote, between the paws of the Sphinx near the Great Pyramid, likely during a time of planetary awakening. And I'm quoting him again, Edgar Casey here, quote, "There will come a time when the records of Atlantis shall be uncovered near the Sphinx. that there may be the opening of the records that are as yet to be discovered. And there's another quote by Casey: Egypt was the center where the activities of the Atlanteans were preserved and where the records are to be uncovered. So it's very fascinating, even with light of these recent discoveries, which, by the way, is a lot of debate about if it's real or not real, of these so-called sonar radar images underneath the pyramid. They extend way down in the spiral form with supposedly underground bases or underground chambers under the big pyramid. So something is happening there. Do you know anything more about that at all?
No, but personally, I think that since this discovery heralds potentially like a change in what we understand to be modern history, you are going to get some backlash from people who are in the modern scientific community, or, you know, the thing is like when you get revealed information that previously contradicts what you believe to be true, I think that there is going to be a lot of backlash around that. And when I look at like where humanity is at now, I'm not sure if the consensus, meaning 85% of the mainstream population, is actually ready to accept this. So you know, there's going to be a lot of bumps, I think, in the road. Yeah. And also, again, it's not just physical, it's also the non-physical aspect, which I think is the most interesting.
What Steiner, emphasized as well. So obviously there's an Egyptian Atlantis karmic continuum, as we can already see with Steiner, and Casey also saw Egypt as a karmic continuation of Atlantis. And according to him, many Atlantean souls reincarnate in Egypt to heal the past misuse of power, to anchor spiritual teachings, and prepare for future awakenings, like our current era. However, the rise of Egypt was an opportunity to redeem the errors of Atlantis and create a spiritual civilization, but that fell again as well. We didn't learn the lessons. Or according to Steiner, was a necessary fall of Egypt to prepare for the Christ impulse in this current era, right? Everything happens in cycles. But Casey also says, just as Rudolf Steiner, that humanity now stands at a similar crossroad. Will we repeat the fall of Atlantis, or awaken and integrate technology with wisdom? Now, that kind of concludes the summary of Rudolf Steiner's view on Atlantis and Egypt, Plato's view on Atlantis, and Edgar Cayce. And you see already a lot of similarities. So let's look at the shared themes between Steiner and Cayce's view on Atlantis and Egypt. And also Plato ties into that as well.
Okay, so number one, Atlantis was real. It was a prehistoric civilization. This is not a myth. This is not an allegory. And another point, main theme that they both agree on, Atlantis reached high levels of spiritual and technological advancement far beyond what modern science acknowledges. Human consciousness at Atlantis was far more intuitive and spiritually in tune than we are now. We're very, by the way, grounded into materialism. We are in the Iron Age.
Yes.
So it's dense, it's hard, we're identified with materialism. It's very different than this etheric moving into physical form nature that the Atlanteans had. We're so grounded in materialism that many people actually think that that's all there is. So very different civilization. And they also had a direct connection to cosmic or divine forces. Now you talk about that and people call you like woo-woo or weird. So look at how far we've gone from then. The fall of Atlantis was also due to moral and spiritual corruption, which is both what Steiner and Cayce agreed upon, and especially around misuse of power, misuse of energy, and misuse of life force. And the division of polarity that existed in Atlantean society was between a spiritually aligned group and a materialistic, self-serving group. Very similar to this like timeline split that we see now, which we're going to talk about more in the second hour when we link it to modern times and everything that's happening in the world right now, especially in Pluto and Aquarius. Again, Steiner and Cayce also agreed that the Atlantean survivors carried their wisdom to Egypt and other parts of the world after the destruction. Ancient Egypt was a continuation of Atlantean spiritual science, and they preserved and adapted this spiritual science for a new phase of human evolution. And again, they also agreed the Great Pyramid and the Egyptian mystery schools were tools for spiritual initiation and soul evolution, not merely tombs or religious sites, which is the history that we've been sold by the consensus narrative. Reincarnation and karma also link modern souls to Atlantis and Egypt, meaning many people today are reliving or healing those ancient patterns. And they also both agree that humanity stands at a similar crossroads spiritually, and they face choices about how to use power, how to use technology and consciousness. And they both, Casey and Steiner, warned against materialism, which again is more about identification with the physical and thinking the physical is all there is, transhumanism, and the loss of spiritual connection, which echoes the conditions that led to Atlantis' fall. And most importantly, we need to look at karma as an opportunity, right? It doesn't matter how heavy the weight of karma you carry. There's a famous story about Milarepa, even in Tibetan Buddhism, which is used as a source of inspiration. Milarepa was a black magician who achieved enlightenment in a single lifetime and was able to transmute a very heavy karmic load into basically achieving enlightenment. So we need to really look at not to see, oh my God, here we go again, we're doomed. This is a really disempowering mindset. We really need to see this as a spiritual opportunity to redeem the mistakes that were made in Atlantis through our own awakening, through right use of power, and through alignment with natural and divine law. So this is really important. And this is not also going to be easy, by the way, because we also have different Seratic spirits operating through transhumanism who can influence us, etc. But the amazing thing now is even in Steiner's time, you didn't have access to the spiritual and mystical knowledge that you did back then. It was very hard to find. Now through the internet, you can gain access to any information, any tool. The question is will you actually apply that? And in your life, right? That's the real point, is you can have access to all the wisdom in the world, but the question is do you actually apply it? You can know that doing meditation is really good for you, but do you actually apply that? So this is the whole thing. And so, basically to summarize, Steiner and Casey both emphasize that many people today are reincarnations of Atlanteans, and they're here to rebalance past karma, make different choices, and reclaim their spiritual wisdom without falling into ego and control. And to quote Steiner, he says, "The souls that lived in Atlantis now have returned to complete their tasks. Humanity is being tested again," end quote. So in closing, we need to really think about the karmic seed that was planted in Atlantis. How are we reliving it now? And as we move into part 2, we're going to ask the question, what will this Atlantean and Egyptian karma look like in modern times? So for those who are new to our podcast, we always have a part 2. You can join by going to veilofreality.com/membership, and you'll get access to over 150 hours of podcasts that we've recorded. And you can gain access to the second hour. And in the second hour, we're going to discuss most of all, how our Atlantean karma is related to modern times, how that's surfacing, how this relates to the whole transhumanism agenda, the temptations of using advanced technology without the spiritual grounding. We're also going to discuss Pluto and Scorpio and how they relate to past lives in Egypt and what their karmic signature is around this. And I'm not just saying it's just Pluto and Scorpio who have Atlantean karma, but they seem to have a specific karma with Egypt, which connects them to Atlantis. We're also going to talk about COVID vaccines as modern extensions of Atlantean and Egyptian black magic sorcery. We're going to talk about the karmic lessons that could be involved, some questions that you can ask yourself. How can we possibly redeem ourselves from this Atlantean karma? And we're going to give you just suggestions on how you can look at how this may be manifesting in your own life and how you can decide to make different choices with the use of technology and spiritual wisdom in this lifetime, and see maybe how your own personal life experiences perhaps connect with this replay of Atlantean karma especially, by the way, since we're in Pluto and Aquarius generation, my intuitive sense that a lot of these souls who are going to be incarnating with Pluto and Aquarius will have direct connections to Atlantis as well. And we're going to see an influx of them as we reach the height of this all. So be very interesting. And if you want to join us, please go again to veilofreality.com/membership, and we'll see you in the second hour.